I assure you, gentlemen, my resolve is unshaken. We will proceed as planned, and any who oppose this course...
They had been waiting for a prince, a child born of Tudor blood, destined to inherit the throne, to continue the imperial dream of Henry VIII, the king, infamous for marrying 6 women and sending 2 of them to the scaffold. But when the first cry echoed through Greenwich Palace on an autumn day in the year 1533, it was not a boy. It was a girl, a princess who, from the very first breath, was marked for exile, seen as a disappointment, rejected by God's clergy, and unwelcomed by the powerful Elizabeth, daughter of Henry and his second wife. Anne Boleyn was not only unwanted by her father, but condemned by the Catholic Church, which refused to acknowledge the marriage that had birthed her. They called her illegitimate, cursed her as the symbol of sin and schism, and so, before she could walk or speak, Elizabeth had already become a fracture line between 2 warring worlds, the England desperate for reform, and the Church that burned in wrath. 2 years after her birth, her mother was taken to the executioner's block. Anne Boleyn, the queen who had once stolen the king's heart, was now charged with adultery and incest, a thin excuse hiding the king's desire for a new wife. Elizabeth was stripped of her title, cast out of the line of succession, and sent away from the court. But where other children might have been buried by silence and shame, Elizabeth endured. Not merely survived, she evolved. At Hatfield, where she was effectively exiled, Elizabeth was raised by fiercely loyal women like Cat Ashley, and transformed into something strange, something rare, a noble girl with no throne, a sharp mind honed in secrecy, a child who learned early that silence could save her life in a world of silk-draped wolves. Her childhood was paved with death, her mother beheaded, her stepmother, Catherine Howard, executed for betrayal, her father, the great Henry, dead by the time she was 13, her half-brother Edward, crowned young, withered even younger from consumption. The English throne had become a fire pit, and Elizabeth stood quietly near it, neither burned nor crowned. She had no armies, no alliances, no male protector, only books, silence, and a mind that seemed to grasp something even she didn't yet understand. One day, she would need to outlive them all. Then came Mary, the half-sister, devout Catholic, ruthless queen. She rose to power on the promise of restoring England to the Church. And Elizabeth, a known Protestant, instantly became a threat. She was watched, followed, accused, locked away for a year, sleeping each night, unsure if her neck would meet the axe at dawn. But still, she did not DL. Not like her mother. Not like the others who had dared to wear a crown or love a king. Elizabeth understood something they hadn't. Survival was not about power. Patience. And so she waited. Silent as stone. Cloaked in modesty. Vanishing from the eyes of court while watching everything with hawk-like focus. Then came the moment no one expected. In the year 1558, Mary died, childless, bitter, and broken. And from the shadows stepped Elizabeth. Not by force, not by bloodshed. She rose like smoke from a long-burning ember. The forgotten girl became Queen of England. Young, unmarried, untouched by the hands of men. She wore the crown alone. And from that moment, she ruled not as a woman looking for a husband, but as a sovereign who trusted no one to share her throne. But Elizabeth was no easy queen. She rejected suitors from Spain, from Sweden, from Austria, even Robert Dudley, her childhood companion and rumored lover, was kept at arm's length. She would not marry. She would not bear heirs. She would not give away an inch of her power. Elizabeth declared herself a virgin queen, a bride to her realm, and turned loneliness into armor, abstinence into strategy. With a crown on her head and solitude at her side, she became an enigma no man could own, and every monarch feared. Then came the great enemy, Spain. The mighty Catholic Empire, scorned and enraged by Elizabeth's rejection of marriage, and even more furious when she secretly backed Francis Drake's piratical raids on their treasure ships. When Spain howled for justice, Elizabeth knighted Drake instead, a masterstroke of provocation cloaked in diplomacy. War was inevitable. The Spanish Armada, a fleet the world called invincible, was dispatched to crush England. But Elizabeth was ready. She had no towering army, but she had a fleet, a strategy, and the undying loyalty of her people. And when the hour came, she stood in armor before her soldiers, declaring she had the heart and stomach of a king, not a queen, a king, and her words cut deeper than any sword. Under her command, England defied the impossible, and Spain's great fleet was scattered by storms and English steel. The victory rewrote history and sealed Elizabeth's name into legend. In her later years, Elizabeth turned to the arts. She adored plays, especially those of a certain William Shakespeare. While she never walked among the commoners in playhouses, she summoned the theater to her court, even forming her own troupe, Queen Elizabeth's Men. She may also have been the first English monarch to sip tea, brought in by the East India Company, a tiny taste that would centurer la terre, define a nation. But beneath the white makeup, the towering orange wig, and the gowns worn only once, was a woman alone, a woman who had seen too much death to risk love, a woman who had once been discarded, but died a sovereign feared by empires. On the 14th of March, in the year 1603, Elizabeth breathed her last. No husband, no children, no heir of blood. But her people wept, and 4 grey horses draped in black velvet bore her body through the streets of London to Westminster Abbey, where she rests in eternal silence. She was the last of the Tudors, the last of the monarchs who ruled with fire, fear, and unshakable will. And long after her white mask faded, her shadow remained, the girl who was never meant to reign, but refused to die until the world knelt before her, before she was a queen, before her name carried the weight of an empire. Elizabeth was just a girl in a damp castle surrounded by whispers. Hatfield was cold, and the fog never seemed to lift. It clung to the windows like ghosts of the past, seeping into the stones, soaking into her shoes, curling around her as she sat by the fire with her books and her silence. She was not a princess then. Not officially. She had been erased from the line of succession when her mother's head fell from her shoulders. The crown had no place for a child born of scandal. And so she sat in the corner of history, small, sharp-eyed, and forgotten, but not broken. She had no mother. Anne Boleyn had been executed before Elizabeth was old enough to remember the sound of her voice. But the world never let her forget what her mother had been accused of: adultery, incest, treason. The daughter bore the shadow of the mother. Every look, every curtsy, every guarded whisper reminded her that she was different. Not like the others, not wanted. But that didn't mean she was unloved. For in that cold, grey castle, she had Cat Ashley, her governess, her guardian, her quiet protector. It was Cat who taught her to read not only books, but people. Cat who turned lessons into games and lullabies into strategies, and it was Cat who gave her the armor she would need to survive, a world built by men who saw her only as a mistake. She learned early that knowledge was safer than affection, so she studied while others danced. Latin, Greek, French, Italian. She copied the Psalms by candlelight. She embroidered patterns not just for beauty, but to calm her mind when the air grew thick with rumors. Elizabeth's mind became her shield. Her words, a blade sharper than any dagger. In time, her father remarried again, and again, and again, each time offering a new woman to call mother, and each time reminding Elizabeth that the role of queen came with no guarantees, only graves. But one of them was different. Catherine Howard was barely older than Elizabeth herself, a girl queen with soft hands and a nervous laugh. She gave Elizabeth small gifts, a ribbon, a comb, a smile. For a short while, Elizabeth felt something like warmth. But the warmth was brief. Catherine was caught in the same web that had devoured Anne, accused of betrayal, dragged to the tower, silenced by the sword. Elizabeth was left holding a silk handkerchief that smelled faintly of roses and fear. She was only 8, but she had seen 2 queens die, and deep within her, something hardened. Then came Catherine Parr, older, wiser, kinder. She brought light back into Elizabeth's world. She convinced the aging king to restore Elizabeth's status, to acknowledge her not as a mistake, but as his daughter. The title of princess was returned. Though the danger remained, still, it was enough. Enough to give Elizabeth back her voice, enough to let her imagine something more than exile. She threw herself deeper into her studies, mastering the art of conversation, the secrets of diplomacy, the dance of masks and meaning that made up court life, while other girls dreamed of ballads and bouquets. Elizabeth studied Cicero and history. She watched the world closely, speaking rarely, thinking always. Her relationship with Catherine Parr grew deeper after Henry's death. Elizabeth moved into her household, where tutors were strict and learning was constant. But even here, danger slithered in. Catherine had remarried to Thomas Seymour, a man with ambition in his eyes and hunger in his blood. He was charming, far too charming, and his behavior toward Elizabeth was unfit. He would visit her early in the morning, enter her chambers without knocking, tickle her, flirt. Elizabeth was still only 14, and although she knew to say little, the court began to murmur. Eventually, the situation could not be ignored. Catherine Parr, now pregnant and disturbed by the rumors, sent Elizabeth away. The girl returned to Hatfield, carrying with her not only shame, but a new understanding the court would always hunger for her, twist her, try to claim her, her body, her name, her silence. All were currency in the game of power. And if she let her guard down, she would end up like the women who came before. So she stayed in the mist, the quiet, the solitude. They became her refuge. Hatfield was more than a castle. It was a waiting room, a training ground, a sanctuary with shadows. There, she built her strength, word by word, book by book. She did not chase attention. She learned how to be ignored. And in that invisibility, she grew sharper, colder, wiser. The child of scandal was becoming something else, something dangerous. Visitors came and went. Letters arrived in coded Latin, filled with court news and political whispers. But Elizabeth did not return to court. Not yet. Not until she was ready. Outside her window, the fog thickened, and somewhere in the halls, the echoes of her mother's laughter still lingered, haunting the girl who would one day rewrite history with the very name the world once tried to erase. There was no coronation for Elizabeth that did not carry ghosts. When she stepped into the role of queen in the year 1558, she was not just inheriting a throne, but walking into the scorched ruins left behind by her sister Mary's reign, a reign remembered less for peace and more for smoke, blood, and fire. The people had grown weary of executions and fearful sermons. They longed for something gentler, something more balanced. They wanted a monarch who would not punish their souls or stake their hearts on the altar of Rome. They wanted breath after suffocation. And somehow, in the quiet grace of Elizabeth's ascent, they found it. But becoming queen was not the same as knowing how to rule. Elizabeth was 25, unmarried, and politically alone. Every eye turned to her with questions sharpened into blades. Would she marry? Would she bear a child? Would she drag the country back into the chaos of religious warfare? Would she, like her father, execute for convenience? Or like her mother, and fall victim to ambition? Elizabeth understood the weight of these questions. And in her first act of power, she gave the world a riddle. She chose not to answer them at all. Instead, she focused on posture, on silence, on the steady rhythm of presence. Her coronation was rich in symbolism, not extravagant, but deeply calculated. She walked through the city in golden robes, blessing the poor, greeting the crowds, smiling in the sunlight. Her image became a spell, a myth in motion. She would be seen, but not touched, heard, but not commanded. She belonged to no man, and in that, she became untouchable. Elizabeth quickly surrounded herself with brilliant minds. William Cecil, her chief advisor, became both mentor and guardian. A man whose loyalty was forged not in fear, but in respect. With his guidance, Elizabeth began the work of untangling the religious web her siblings had spun. She was Protestant, yes, but not fanatical. She restored the Church of England, but left room for private worship. She understood that peace came not from purging, but from letting people believe quietly, without fear. In the dangerous dance between faith and politics, Elizabeth did not stomp. She glided, but peace never lasted long in England. Not with old enemies watching from across the sea, and not with vultures circling her marital status. Foreign courts sent ambassadors with bouquets and veiled threats. The King of Spain offered marriage. Again. So did Austria. So did France. Even Sweden sent a hopeful prince. They offered gold, soldiers, protection. But each offer came with chains. Elizabeth smiled, deflected, and never said yes. Her people waited for a wedding. The court speculated endlessly. But deep down, Elizabeth had already decided she would not give England a king. Even Robert Dudley, the man who knew her better than most, who had held her hand through the long shadows of youth, was denied the crown. Their closeness was undeniable, and tongues wagged behind heavy drapes. They wrote letters, shared glances, perhaps even shared secrets beneath the moonlight. But Elizabeth knew love had teeth. She had seen it tear through queens, ruin alliances, break empires. If she let it claim her, it would break her reign in half. So she held the crown tighter and let her heart drift like mist behind her eyes. In the end, she married no one. She ruled alone, and that solitude became the cornerstone of her myth. Still, Ruling was never easy. The economy trembled. The Catholic threat never truly died. Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin and rival, lingered like a storm just beyond the hills. A queen in her own right, Mary had blood claims to the English throne and Catholic support from abroad. She was exiled, imprisoned, watched, and yet always dangerous. Plots rose around her name, like weeds in a garden. And Elizabeth, though reluctant, came to understand the cruel arithmetic of survival. In the year 1587, after years of suspicion, evidence, and betrayal, Mary was executed. Elizabeth signed the order with shaking hands, not for revenge, not for glory, but for necessity. It was a choice she would carry to the grave. Years passed. Parliament continued to pressure her to marry, to secure a blood heir, to name a successor. But Elizabeth, steadfast and deliberate, refused to be hurried. She spoke of England as her child, and called herself married to the realm. Her unmarried status became both symbol and shield. It allowed her to play Catholic kings against Protestant ones, to flirt with alliances without committing to any. Her virginity was not weakness, it was strategy. And in time, it became legend. She crafted her image like a sculptor, working in ivory. Her wardrobe sparkled with gems and intricate embroidery. Her face powdered white to cover the scars of smallpox. Her red wigs coiled like fire around her crown. She wore her body like armor, built for spectacle, meant to dazzle and dominate. Pain was hidden beneath pearls. Age was drowned beneath layers of silk. Emotion was buried beneath centuries of royal posture. The girl from Hatfield was gone. In her place stood Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the eternal monarch, the myth in motion. And yet, behind closed doors, she still had her moments of tenderness. She cherished her musicians, wept at poems, adored the theater, especially the works of a young playwright named William Shakespeare. She summoned his troupe to court, demanded performances, rewarded him generously. In his plays, she saw reflections of her own contradictions, the ambition, the solitude, the aching weight of command. Through Hamlet's grief, through Viola's disguise, through Lear's unraveling, she found the ghosts of her own past. And in those quiet moments, she was not just a queen, she was human. But the burdens of rule were many. As the years wore on, her court grew younger while she aged alone. The mirror became an enemy. The laughter of courtiers turned sharp. Even Robert Dudley, her closest companion, was gone. She did not replace him. She could not. In public, she remained radiant. In private, she grew tired. Yet still, she would not name an heir. Still, she would not yield. For Elizabeth, to wear the crown was not simply duty. It was identity. She had forged herself into something beyond ordinary womanhood. A symbol, a monarch who could not be outmaneuvered, outloved, or overthrown. And though she knew the day would come when her breath would leave her body and the crown would pass to another, she refused to look beyond it. The present was hers, and as long as she sat on that throne, no one, not Parliament, not the Church, not Spain, not France, not even time itself, would take it from her. Long before her hand signed the death warrant, long before the scaffold was raised and the sword sharpened, Elizabeth had already been haunted by Mary. She was not just another monarch. Mary, Queen of Scots, was a walking threat. Her presence alone made the ground shift. She was Catholic. Beautiful. Widowed, young but dangerously connected. A French queen consort before she was 18. And queen regnant of Scotland from infancy. But most of all, she had Tudor blood in her veins. Through her grandmother, Mary carried a claim to the English crown that, to many Catholics, seemed stronger than Elizabeth's own. And from the moment Elizabeth took the throne, Mary became both shadow and reflection. A rival who wore the title of queen with the same grace, but a different God. They never met. Not once. Though they wrote to one another, signed their names with affection, and played the strange game of royal diplomacy. They were always apart. Two women born to rule, but bound by suspicion, envy, and the crushing weight of history. Elizabeth called Mary sister, sometimes cousin, but she never truly trusted her. How could she? Mary had married unwisely in Scotland. Her second husband was murdered in a plot that stank of scandal. And her third, the Earl of Bothwell, was accused of orchestrating it. When she married him, willingly or not, it was the final straw. The Scottish lords revolted. Mary was forced to abdicate, fleeing to England in search of sanctuary. What she found instead was a prison. Elizabeth did not kill her immediately. She didn't even plan to imprison her at first. But the danger was too great. Mary, even in disgrace, was a symbol. Catholic nobles across Europe whispered her name like a prayer. And in the hearts of English recusants, she was the queen who should have been. So Elizabeth had her watched closely, locked in various estates, castles, and country manors. Grand and gilded, but sealed with fear. Mary lived for 19 years like this, always in a golden cage, always under guard, always writing letters, receiving secret visitors, waiting for someone to rise in her name. And many did. There were plots, dozens. Some were real, others imagined, but all pointed to the same conclusion: Mary was too dangerous to live. The Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot. Each time Elizabeth hesitated, hoping she would never be forced to go further. Each time Mary was questioned, her eyes full of sorrow, her lips insisting on innocence, but the evidence kept mounting. Messages smuggled in beer barrels, codes in embroidery, letters signed with care, bearing her seal, approving of Elizabeth's death. And then, in the year 1586, the Babington plot was uncovered, a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. This time, Mary's fingerprints were undeniable. Elizabeth wept when she saw the proof, not because she doubted it, but because she had run out of excuses. She had delayed for years, hoping fate would spare her from this choice. She feared not only the moral weight of killing an anointed queen, but the political backlash that would follow. Would France retaliate? Would Spain declare war? Would Mary become a martyr and plunge England into rebellion? But more than that, Elizabeth feared herself. To sign the execution order was to step into her father's shadow, to become not the Virgin Queen, but the Killer Queen. And yet, what other choice remained? The warrant was signed, slowly, reluctantly, then sealed and locked away, perhaps in the hope that it would never be used. But her council, led by William Cecil, knew better. They pushed it forward, carried it to Fotheringhay Castle. And there, on a cold morning in February of the year 1587, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was executed. She dressed in red, the color of Catholic martyrdom. Her hair was coiled beneath a black veil, her face serene, When she laid her head upon the block, she whispered prayers in Latin. The axe fell once, then again, and again. 3 strikes to sever a queen from her crown. Her lips were still moving when the head dropped. The room was silent, and in that silence, history trembled. When word reached Elizabeth, she was furious, or claimed to be. She locked herself in her chambers. She lashed out at her council. She declared that they had acted without her final consent. Whether this was true or carefully constructed remorse, no one knows. But for days, she did not eat. For weeks, she did not smile. Something inside her changed. Even those closest to her could see it. Elizabeth had killed a woman who had called her sister, a queen who had shared her blood, and though it had been necessary, though it had secured her reign, it had also torn something invisible and sacred. Mary was buried in Peterborough Cathedral, and years later, her body would be moved to Westminster Abbey, not far from Elizabeth's own tomb. 2 queens, laid to rest beneath the same stone roof. Though they never once stood face to face in life, theirs was a battle fought in letters, in politics, in shadow. One ruled from the throne, the other from the cage. But in the end, it was the cage that fell. Elizabeth never spoke of Mary again in detail. Not in public. But her wardrobe darkened, her laugh grew thinner. She never again trusted easily. The world had seen her mercy wear thin, and it had loved her a little less for it. And Elizabeth, always attuned to how history would remember her. I began to build her mask even higher. She strengthened her navy. She prepared for the Spanish Armada. She turned her pain into steel. But at night, when the court was quiet and the fire burned low, it is said she sometimes stood before the mirror, silent, and perhaps, just once, she wondered what might have been if she had opened the door that day. Let Mary enter, and said, let us not be enemies. But such words were never spoken. And in the kingdom of queens, forgiveness was a language no one remembered how to speak. It did not begin with gunpowder. It began with silence, a silence that stretched across the sea, thick with salt and suspicion. From the moment Elizabeth took the throne, Spain had watched her, not with curiosity, but with a slow-growing fury, as if a fire had been lit far below the waves and had taken years to surface. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, a Protestant queen ruling a country that had once sworn its soul to Rome, she was, to King Philip of Spain, a walking provocation. And worse, she had rejected him. Once, long ago, in the first years of her reign, he had offered marriage. It would have unified kingdoms, quieted religion, restored the broken bridge between England and Catholic Europe. But Elizabeth had said no, politely, coldly, without apology. And then came the ships, not English warships, but English pirates, though Elizabeth preferred to call them privateers, men like Francis Drake, brave and brutal, who took to the oceans, not just to explore, but to rob. They raided Spanish treasure galleons, stormed coastal colonies, and brought back chests of gold and silver to the cheering court of England. Elizabeth never claimed to command these men directly, but she knighted Drake with a smile when he returned. She called him my pirate. Spain called him something else. And in the Palace of Madrid, Philip brooded. The sea, once a boundary, became a battlefield. Spanish ships filled with spices and silver were attacked. Izunk, stolen from beneath the flag of God. Philip saw the theft not only as robbery, but as blasphemy. England, he believed, had turned away from heaven, and now it would face judgment. In the year 1585, war became official. But the planning had already begun long before. Philip ordered the building of a massive fleet, ships by the dozens, filled with soldiers, priests, food, and cannon. He called it the Grande y Felicissima Armada, the great and most fortunate fleet. The name itself was an omen, though the future would laugh at it later. It was meant to be invincible. A storm of sails and iron that would sweep across the channel, crush the English navy, and bring the Queen to her knees. Elizabeth knew it was coming. She had spies in every court, informants in every port. Her council urged her to prepare, to raise taxes, to fortify the coast. But England was not a land of great armies. Its navy, though agile, was smaller. Its people were proud, but outnumbered. And Elizabeth, though strong in will, had never faced war on this scale. Yet when the Armada set sail in the summer of 1588, she did not panic. She summoned her admirals. She prepared her ships. And most importantly, she prepared her people. At Tilbury, where the English forces were gathered, she rode before them on horseback, clad in white, wearing armor upon her chest, the wind lifting her red-gold hair like a banner. She spoke not as a woman, but as a warrior. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she said, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too." The words did not echo in history books. They burned into the blood of every soldier who heard them. And then the Armada came. It was vast, a crescent of ships spreading across the horizon, black against the gray-blue sky. But it was also slow, heavy with weight and tradition. The Spanish plan was to sail north, join forces with troops from the Netherlands, and launch an invasion from the shores of Kent. But the English navy, faster, smaller, unburdened by grandeur, did not wait for them to arrive. Francis Drake and his fellow captains harassed the Armada as it sailed, darting in and out like wasps. They set fire to empty ships and sent them burning into the Spanish formation, the infamous fireships of Calais, sowing chaos and forcing the massive galleons to scatter. In the open sea, where Spain expected a straight duel, England gave them a storm. The Channel became a battlefield of confusion. Cannon fire cracked like thunder. Smoke curled into the clouds. Spanish ships collided, lost their anchors, drifted. The English, with their long-range guns and nimble maneuvering, struck again and again without waiting for reply. And then came the wind. No weapon in Elizabeth's arsenal was as devastating as the weather. Storms lashed the Armada as it tried to retreat northward, rounding Scotland to escape the English bite. Many ships were wrecked upon the coasts of Ireland. Thousands of men drowned, starved, or froze. The fleet limped home, not to fanfare, but to silence and shame. Of more than 130 ships, fewer than half returned. England rejoiced. Bells rang. Bonfires burned. Poems were written. Medals struck. And Elizabeth's legend, already growing like ivy over the walls of Europe, now bloomed in full. She was no longer just the Virgin Queen. She was the woman who had defied an empire, the queen who faced an armada and did not bow. But in the quiet that followed, Elizabeth did not gloat. She sent letters of thanksgiving to her commanders, offered prayers in public chapels, but never bragged. The defeat of Spain, she knew, was not the end. It was only survival. The wars would continue. The threats would evolve. And so she kept building, kept watching, kept ruling, not with the iron fist of her father, but with a colder, steadier hand. Years later, when she looked back upon that summer, perhaps she did not think of victory. Perhaps she thought of the sleepless nights, the maps spread across tables, the letters she read with trembling fingers, the men who died at sea for her name, and perhaps, when she lay alone in her bed, crown beside her on the table, she remembered how close the waves had come, how easily the world could have changed. But it didn't, because when the storm rose, she did not run. She stood at the shore, and England, watching her figure wrapped in silver and flame, believed not just in a monarch, but in a myth. There is a strange kind of beauty that forms when a person becomes a symbol, a beauty that is not warm, not soft, but sculpted, like a statue carved from ivory and shadow. By the final years of her reign, Elizabeth was no longer merely a queen. She had become something else entirely. A living myth. A portrait? A ghost wrapped in pearls. She walked through her palaces like a vision. No one dared disturb. Draped in gowns that shimmered like starlight. Her face painted pure white. Untouched by age. Untouched by time. But behind that painted mask was a woman who had lived too long with power, too long with solitude, and too long without the right to fall apart. She had once been modest in her appearance, careful with her clothing, quiet in her display of wealth. But that woman, the girl of Hatfield, the scholar of restraint, was gone. In her place now stood Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, who wore only the rarest silks, who changed outfits twice a day, who never wore the same jewel-studded robe twice. She did not dress to impress men, she dressed to dominate the room. Each ruff wider than the last, each gown more intricate, each wig more blazing than the one before. And still, it was not vanity. It was defense. Armor made of fabric and powder. For the older she grew, the more she hid behind the image she had built. Because once you rule as an icon, you must never appear mortal again. The white paint, that famous mask, was more than just fashion. It was survival. Years earlier, she had suffered from smallpox. She had survived it. But the illness had left her skin marked and uneven. The white lead-based makeup covered it, smoothed it, created a blank canvas. But the cost was terrible. The lead seeped into her blood, slowly poisoning her from within. Still, she kept applying it, layer after layer, because no one could see her age. No one could see her fade. She painted youth on her face every morning, and with every stroke, she buried another part of herself beneath it. In court, she was fire and frost. Her temper was legendary, her demands unrelenting. Courtiers learned to read her silences like omens. To displease her was to risk exile, but to please her too much was to stir jealousy. She ruled with charm and cruelty in equal measure, laughing with her favorites one day, banishing them the next. There were few who could remain close to her for long without being burned, and fewer still who saw the exhaustion behind her golden eyes. She had no children, no husband, no companion in her bedchamber when the candles burned low. The world believed she had given her body to England. But England, in truth, had taken far more: her softness, her laughter, her vulnerability. Those things had been exchanged long ago for steel. Even Robert Dudley, the man she had loved in silence for decades, had died. She wore black for him for months, refused to speak of him publicly, and yet never visited his grave. She mourned in private, as she lived, half hidden, half lit, always guarded. And as the world changed around her, Elizabeth began to retreat into ritual, into ceremony, into performance. Every morning became a production. The rising of the Queen, the process by which her ladies dressed her, painted her, arranged her hair, selected her jewels, could take hours. It was theater, and she was the star. But even the finest stage curtains cannot hide the ticking of time. Her teeth had begun to decay. Her hair thinned beneath the weight of her wigs. Her appetite shrank. Her hands trembled. And yet she smiled. Always smiled. Because to falter in public was to invite vulture. Still, she ruled. She ruled through famine, through economic hardship, through mounting criticism from a younger generation who saw her not as a savior but as a shadow from another age. The courtiers around her became younger, more impatient. They whispered of James of Scotland. They speculated about succession, and Elizabeth, though she never named an heir aloud. I knew the future was no longer hers, but she would not surrender to it. Not yet. The arts, which had once been her pleasure, became her sanctuary. She turned more frequently to music, to poetry, to the comfort of Shakespeare's plays. He, too, had aged during her reign. His earliest works had amused her. His tragedies now echoed the weariness in her bones. She watched Lear rage against the storm, and perhaps saw something of herself in his madness. A monarch betrayed by time, a ruler crumbling beneath the crown. Yet even in her final years, she refused to be seen as weak. When sickness came, she denied it. When sadness came, she swallowed it. Her ladies reported that she would sit for hours in her chamber, silent, unmoving, staring into nothing. They would find her on the floor, resting her head against cushions, her fingers wrapped around the skirts of the past. And when they begged her to take to her bed, she refused. Queens do not sleep. Queens do not die. Queens endure, but not forever. In the winter of the year, 1602, Elizabeth caught a chill that would not lift. Her health declined slowly, but her will remained iron. She gave no orders, named no successor, and resisted all suggestions that she rest. When she finally lay upon the cushions for the last time, she was surrounded by her women. No husband's hand to hold, no child's voice to call her mother. Only the loyal hearts of those who had served her and seen her cry when no one else could. She died on the 14th of March. In the year 1603, no trumpets, no final words heard across the land. Just breath, then stillness. The end of an era, and when they dressed her for burial, they laid her in white, white as the mask she had worn, white as the powder that may have poisoned her, white as the myth she had become. 4 gray horses carried her through the streets of London. Black velvet draped their flanks. The people wept, not only for the queen they had lost, but for the time that was gone with her. Elizabeth had ruled for 45 years. She had survived assassination plots, foreign invasions, internal rebellion, and the crushing loneliness of power. She had ruled as a woman in a world that hated female strength. And in doing so, she had turned herself into something unforgettable, not entirely woman, not quite goddess, not truly mortal. She became the mirror the world looked into, and the mask it could never remove. She ruled alone, and she died alone. And in between those two silences lay a question that haunted all of England for nearly half a century. Who comes next? Elizabeth never answered. Not once. Not clearly, not openly. While she breathed, she ruled. And while she ruled, she refused to surrender even a sliver of her crown to speculation. She had no child, no husband, no officially declared heir. And yet, every man in court, every ambassador, every poet, and every whispering servant knew that the future had to come eventually, and it had a name. James. James of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the grandson of Margaret Tudor, Elizabeth's own aunt. He was blood, but barely, Protestant, but raised by wary hands, king of another land, but watching England like a cat watches a door ajar. For years, he had waited, writing cautious letters, sending polished ambassadors, flattering when needed, retreating when pushed. He called Elizabeth his beloved aunt, his second mother, his guiding star. Though they had never met, she read his letters in silence, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes tossing them aside. She never answered in writing. Not directly, for Elizabeth understood one thing more than anyone alive: to name a successor while still wearing the crown was to invite death by 1,000 knives. She had seen it happen. She had lived it. Mary had named Elizabeth, and Elizabeth had spent a year in chains. The very idea of a future monarch stirred plots, drew daggers, pulled loyalties away like tide from the sand. And so, she kept the throne wrapped in silence, guarded by mirrors and riddles. She would not name James. She would not name anyone. Instead, she danced whenever Parliament pressed the issue, urging her to consider the line of succession, to provide security, to assure the kingdom. She sidestepped like a seasoned player. She would smile, lift her fan, and speak of loyalty, speak of God, speak of eternity, and then say nothing. A monarch, she believed, must not speak of death. It would give breath to weakness. And Elizabeth, painted and powdered, draped in centuries, could never afford to appear mortal. But in the shadows, the game played on. Ambassadors met in secret. Spies whispered across borders. James wrote to courtiers, promising favor if they remembered him later. Some did. Cecil, the great architect of Elizabeth's reign, kept two minds, one loyal to his queen, the other preparing for the world after her. He studied James, judged his temperament, ensured the Protestant faith would survive a transition. But he did it all quietly, for he knew the wrath of a queen who smelled betrayal. As the queen aged, her court changed. The bright-eyed adventurers of her youth had died or faded. The younger men, bold, impatient, restless, looked to James not with fear, but with opportunity. He was a man. After all, a king, a father. Elizabeth, though powerful, had become a figure of frozen beauty, admired, obeyed, but no longer loved. Not in the way the world once had. She grew keener. The banquets became shorter, the laughter more forced. The fire in her gaze dimmed. And still, she said nothing of succession. In the final year of her reign, England stood at the edge of uncertainty. The Queen was past 69. Her appetite had all but disappeared. Her health was delicate, and yet no proclamation had been made, no word etched into law. The throne was a question mark, and still, the realm waited. Then came the winter, gray and thin and heavy with silence. Elizabeth took to her cushions. not her bed, refusing the symbolic surrender that came with lying beneath covers. Her ladies hovered. Her physicians came and went. But the queen spoke little, only once, when asked who should follow her. And did she raise her hand and point, not to a name, not to a document, just a gesture into the air, subtle and enigmatic. Those present took it to mean James, but no word was written, no signature confirmed, just the weight of gesture, the echo of legacy. When the queen died on the 14th day of March, in the year 1603, she left behind a kingdom stronger than it had been in decades, richer, prouder, feared by its enemies and admired by its allies. And yet, the moment her breath left her, the silence broke. Riders galloped north, with letters sealed in wax. Messages flew from tower to castle, and across the border. In Edinburgh, James received the news. He had waited all his life for it. And now, without lifting a sword, he had inherited a crown his mother had died for. There was no civil war, no rebellion, no last-minute rival. Elizabeth's reign had been so long, so steady, so absolute, that her people accepted James almost with relief. Within weeks, he rode into London. The streets were lined with curious eyes. The courtiers bowed. The crown was placed upon his brow. And the Tudor dynasty, fierce and fiery, drenched in blood and glory, came to an end. But in the minds of her people, Elizabeth never truly left the throne. For years, they continued to speak her name with reverence. Her portraits remained in chambers, her symbols carved into the stone. Her memory lingered in the sighs of the elderly and the dreams of the young bee. And though James ruled in law, Elizabeth reigned in legend. She had left no heir, but she had left something greater, a country transformed, a people proud, and a story that would ripple through centuries. She had refused to name her successor because, deep down, she believed no one could truly follow her. And perhaps, in some hidden chamber of her heart, she was right. It began in stillness. Not the stillness of peace, but of a held breath, the kind that passes through a city when it realizes something eternal has ended. On the morning after Elizabeth died, London did not ring its bells. It did not shout. It did not sing. The news moved through alleyways and across bridges like fog, slow and unsure, as if no one truly believed it yet. For 45 years, she had been the sun at the center of their sky. Now she was gone, and no one quite knew where to look. Her body lay in state at Richmond Palace, guarded day and night, surrounded by tapestries and candles that wept wax onto cold floors. Her ladies sat close, some praying, some too exhausted to do even that. She had died quietly, in her sleep, wrapped in layers of velvet and silence. No dramatic words, no royal performance, only the long exhale of a queen who had finally allowed herself to rest. They prepared her with reverence. No detail was rushed. Her coffin was lined in lead, sealed against the damp air. Over it, a great effigy was placed, a wooden likeness of Elizabeth, dressed in the finery she had worn in life, pearl-draped bodice, red gold wig, pale, powdered face. The lips were painted soft, the eyes closed, and yet even in death, she commanded awe. Courtiers and commoners alike came to bow their heads. Some wept, some only stared. One child, seeing the figure on the casket, whispered, "She's not dead. She's sleeping with her eyes shut." But the kingdom knew better. When the day of the procession came, the 28th of April, in the year 1603, the weather turned somber. A mist hung over the city, soft but steady, as if the skies themselves had chosen mourning. The streets were lined hours before dawn. Children sat atop barrels. Old men leaned on canes. Women clutched the hands of daughters who had never known another monarch. They all waited for the same thing. One last glimpse. One last goodbye. Then the horses appeared, 4 of them. Great gray beasts. Their manes braided with black ribbon. Their bodies cloaked in velvet, so dark it seemed to drink the light. They pulled the funeral chariot. A massive structure carved from blackened wood and gilded silver. At its center rested the coffin of Elizabeth, draped in the royal standard, edged in white silk, guarded by soldiers who walked without blinking. Above her, the effigy stood motionless, holding the scepter and orb. It was not just a coffin. It was a moving monument, a relic in motion. A queen carried through her people like a relic through a cathedral. The procession moved slowly, not out of caution, but out of reverence. Behind the carriage walked hundreds of noblemen in mourning cloaks, bishops in purple, ambassadors from foreign lands, the Earl of Nottingham, her last great sea lord, rode near the front, his face set in stone. Her ladies followed behind, heads bowed, veils soaked with tears. One of them, an old woman who had once braided Elizabeth's hair, stumbled and nearly fell. No one helped her. It was not disrespect. It was understanding. Some grief must be carried alone. The people did not cheer. They did not wave. They stood in silence. Some crossed themselves. Others clutched handkerchiefs to their mouths. A few reached out, fingers stretching toward the passing coffin, as if hoping to touch history one last time. There were no speeches, no songs, only the drumbeat of hooves, the whisper of wheels, and the sound of 1,000 hearts breaking in unison. The route wound from Whitehall to Westminster, crossing the city like a slow river of sorrow. Windows were shuttered, shop signs draped in black. Even the birds seemed quieter, circling the sky in uneasy spirals. At the Abbey, bells tolled, slow, deep, tolls that seemed to echo from under the earth. And when the carriage reached the great doors, the coffin was lifted, carried by 12 men whose arms shook not from weight, but from the terrible privilege of bearing the last of the Tudors into the afterlife. Inside Westminster Abbey, light spilled through stained glass, painting her casket in colors she could no longer see. Candles lined every inch of stone. The scent of lilies mingled with incense. It was cold inside, colder than outside, but no one dared shiver. The ceremony was long and somber, and spoken in the ancient cadences of Latin and English. Both prayers were offered, psalms recited, but when the choir sang, the notes trembled, as if even voices feared to echo too loudly in the presence of such a legacy. Her coffin was lowered into the tomb beside her sister Mary. The irony was not lost. In life, they had rarely agreed. In death, they would lie side by side for eternity. 2 daughters of Henry VIII. 2 queens, one Protestant, one Catholic, one crowned in life, the other crowned in legend. And so, the lid was sealed, the stone was placed, and the Virgin Queen passed into silence. But outside, London could not let go. That night, hundreds gathered again, not by command, but by instinct. They lit candles along the banks of the Thames. They whispered stories. They passed cups of wine, and remembered the woman who had worn her loneliness like armor, who had turned her sorrow into strength, who had led them through wars, plagues, fominess, and the cruel laughter of Europe. Some called her mother, others called her goddess, but most simply called her the queen. She had ruled longer than most of them had lived. She had been their morning prayer and their evening certainty. And now she was gone. But her story had only just begun. She left no child, yet gave birth to a nation. No prince bore her name. No daughter inherited her crown. There was no cradle beside her bed. No tiny hand in her own. No royal blood to carry the torch of Tudor flame. And yet, when England looked into the mirror after her death, it no longer saw a feuding island, haunted by papal threats and foreign powers. It saw itself firm, confident, distinct, shaped by the will of a woman who never married, never gave birth, and never once gave in. Elizabeth had ruled not from a nursery, but from a mind that refused to be conquered. She had forged loyalty, not through bloodlines, but through vision. And though her tomb lay in cold stone beside a sister who had once tried to erase her, it was Elizabeth's name that endured. Mary had ruled from fear, but Elizabeth ruled from the careful illusion of closeness, a queen who walked among her people only in processions, but who lingered in their imaginations like a ghost that whispered strength. For 45 years, she had built not only policies and treaties and monuments, but something rarer, identity. Before Elizabeth, England had been torn between France and Spain, between Rome and Reformation, between old blood and new ideas. But under her gaze, sharp, silent, impossibly steady, the kingdom began to recognize itself as something unified, something proud. She did not give it a child. She gave it a self. And so, her legacy was not bone, not flesh, but memory. It lived in the theater, where Shakespeare's verses echoed her contradictions, regal and wounded, glorious and lonely. It lived in the seas, where sailors still told tales of her eyes watching from the horizon, where Francis Drake's name was spoken in reverent defiance. It lived in the stained glass of country chapels, where her initials sat beside crosses, and it lived in the songs sung by milkmaids and soldiers alike, who called her Good Queen Bess and believed her smile had once stopped an empire. But there was another legacy, too, one she never spoke of, one buried deeper, the legacy of a woman who had spent her entire life surrounded by betrayal, death, and isolation, and had chosen, again and again, not to break. Her heart had been promised to none, because she had watched love destroy the women around her. Her body had remained untouched by marriage, because she had learned how easily affection could become a dagger in the dark. She had sacrificed the softness of a private life in order to keep a kingdom from bleeding. And what did she gain in return? Power, glory, immortality, but also silence. And in that silence, the unanswered question still lingers. Was it worth it? Perhaps she asked herself that in her final nights, staring at the flickering candlelight, while the walls of Richmond Palace closed in around her. Perhaps she looked to the corner where no child stood, to the mirror that no longer returned her youthful image, and wondered if the throne had been a lover too, demanding. But if she mourned what she had never had, she never spoke of it, even to her most trusted ladies, even to the priests who knelt beside her bed. She offered only the queen, never the woman. And yet, in that silence, in that refusal to explain, to confess, to soften, she became something eternal. Monarchs before her had ruled by sword or by inheritance, She ruled by myth, a myth she created, controlled, and then became. She chose not to be remembered for her grief, but for her will, not for the child she never had, but for the country she left behind. When James rode into London, crowned in peace, he entered a kingdom remade in her image. The foundations she laid allowed him to rule without war. The navy she built protected his shores. The Protestant settlement she had so carefully constructed gave him the religious equilibrium he needed to survive. In many ways, Elizabeth's greatest act of motherhood was the quiet way she prepared the throne for someone else, someone who would never thank her, never rival her, and never truly escape her shadow. Centuries passed. Dynasties rose and fell, but her story remained, not because she had loved greatly, not because she had mothered a line of kings, but because she had dared to stand alone. To this day, her image endures. In oil paintings, she stares forward, unblinking, powdered, ageless, the woman who outlived expectations, outmaneuvered enemies, and outshone almost every monarch who followed her. Children learn her name before they understand what a monarchy is. Her face appears on coins, stumps, and tapestries. Her speeches are quoted not for their romance, but for their steel. She was the queen who chose herself, not a wife, not a mother, not a pawn, not a shadow of a man's legacy. She was England, and England, in turn, became her only heir.